Welcome to Tea and Clue's channel, where every story unlocks a new mystery waiting to be unravelled. Grab your favourite cup of coffee, settle in, and prepare to dive into a world full of twists, turns, and unexpected secrets. We'd love to know where you're watching us from. Drop your city and country in the comments below. Stay curious and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let the adventure begin. Chapter 1. The Vicarage Garden Party. The sun shone obligingly over St. Mildred's vicarage, glinting off polished teapots, silver cake tongs, and the occasional monocle. It was a perfect June afternoon, warm, with a slight breeze that set the bunting fluttering along the hedgerows. In the little village of Edgewater, the annual garden party was as much a ritual as evensong or gossip at the butcher's, and just as rich in hidden meaning. Miss Marple sat under the striped tent near the rose arch, her blue-grey eyes quietly observing the comings and goings of her fellow parishioners. Clad in lavender, and with a lace handkerchief tucked neatly into her sleeve, she appeared as unobtrusive as ever, a woman to be offered tea and left to her knitting. Only those who knew her well understood how deeply she listened. The church ladies buzzed like bees around the sponge cakes and cucumber sandwiches. Mrs. Prescott's lemon drizzle was competing silently with Mrs. Goodbody's jam roly-poly for the vicar's praise, and the tension over whose Victoria sponge would win the informal accolades of the day was as taut as piano wire. "I dare say, Jane," said Mrs. Banbury, leaning toward Miss Marple, "Mrs. Goodbody has doubled the sugar in her sponge this year, trying to curry favour with the bishop." Miss Marple smiled without looking up. "Or perhaps she's sweetened it out of guilt. I hear she's borrowed her sister's hens after that unfortunate business with the parish bake-off." Mrs. Banbury gasped, delighted and scandalised. It was during the third pouring of tea that the day took an unexpected turn. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Tewkesbury, had just begun to thank the attendees for their contributions when a sudden clatter drew everyone's attention to the far end of the lawn. There, by the white trellis, a table had overturned, and standing beside it was Mr. Cyril Maddox, Edgewater's most dignified retired colonel, his usually ruddy face ashen, his hands trembling. I say," he stammered, looking down at the object in his hand. It was small, metallic, and oddly out of place. It was a pewter button. No one would have taken much notice, except that Maddox then looked toward the rose bushes, where a crumpled figure lay half hidden among the stems. A woman's body. There was a shriek. A teacup shattered on the flagstones. Someone fainted. Miss Marple, unshaken, rose to her feet and moved carefully toward the body. It was Violet Green. Miss Green had not been a particularly beloved figure in Edgewater. A recent arrival from London, she had rented the old Townsend cottage and made no secret of her desire to modernise the village's customs. She had taken over the library committee, questioned the choir's hymn selection, and insisted on serving French cheeses at the Women's Guild luncheon. There had been some who admired her boldness, mostly men, but many more who bristled. She had also, it was whispered, taken a curious interest in the local historical archives, especially those relating to a now-defunct regiment that had once passed through Edgewater during the wars. "She's dead," said the doctor, arriving 10 minutes later and kneeling beside her. "Neck broken. Must have fallen or been pushed." He glanced up at the crowd of faces now gathered around the rose bushes. Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes had already scanned the ground. A trail of flattened grass, a heel mark near the trellis, and, just barely visible beneath the edge of the overturned tablecloth, a second pewter button. Later, after the police had cordoned off the garden, and after the party had dispersed in hushed groups down the lane, Miss Marple remained. Inspector Cray had arrived from Barchester, all starched collar and officious frown. He recognized Miss Marple instantly and nodded in her direction. "A nasty business, Miss Marple. You don't suppose this was simply a tragic fall?" "Possibly," she said, eyes mild. "But I've never known anyone to fall into rose bushes and lose their buttons in the process." Cray looked intrigued. "You've spotted something already?" "Oh, no," she said, her voice soft. "Only a pattern. And I do like to follow patterns, Inspector." That evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, the gas lamp casting warm pools of light on her needlework. On the side table lay a silver dish, and in it 2 pewter buttons, one slightly scuffed, both military issue. She opened a small notebook and began to jot in her neat looping hand, "Violet Green, recent arrival, known to have delved into local records, not well liked, found dead by trellis. 2 buttons, military, pewter. Colonel Maddox found one. Appeared shocked. Real or too shocked?" She paused. "Button not from current uniform. Older. Possibly pre-WWI. Symbol on crest. Partially faded. Could be Edgewater Volunteer Guard." She tapped her pencil against the paper. Secrets, she thought, were rarely buried by time. They were buried by shame. And shame had a way of growing roots, especially in quiet places where people whispered instead of confessed. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. By the following morning, the village of Edgewater was abuzz with speculation. News of Violet Green's death had travelled faster than the milk cart, and far more efficiently than the vicar's Sunday sermon. Though the garden party had ended in chaos, the gossip it sparked was as orderly and methodical as any bell choir. At the greengrocer's, the topic was ripening faster than the apricots. "Dropped dead in the roses, she did," declared Mrs. Haycombe, clutching a bag of potatoes like they were clues. "And not a mark on her dress, mind you. That's what strikes me. Fell into thorns, they say. Well, I don't believe it." "I heard it was poison," said Elsie Turner, lowering her voice. "A subtle kind. Something foreign." "Foreign?" Mrs. Haycombe scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. No, I'll tell you what it is. It's that Colonel Maddox. Found her? Didn't he? Buttons flying everywhere. You don't just drop a pewter button for no reason." "Pewter?" Elsie frowned. "I thought he was in the Rifles. Didn't they use brass?" Neither woman noticed Miss Marple pause outside the shop front, her gloved hand adjusting her handbag as she listened without appearing to. She continued on, past the village green and the little post office, toward her usual Tuesday coffee with the vicar's wife, Mrs. Tewkesbury. The vicarage drawing-room was filled with the soft scent of lavender polish and honey biscuits. Mrs. Tewkesbury, always a mixture of genteel fluster and quiet pride, was still visibly shaken. "I simply can't believe it," she said, pouring tea with slightly trembling hands. "One moment we were admiring Mrs. Goodbody's sponge, and the next, well, poor Violet, lying in the roses like Ophelia without the poetry." Miss Marple sipped politely. "Did you know?" Well, she asked. Only in the way one must, Mrs. Tewkesbury replied. She had rather strong opinions for someone so new, and she seemed very interested in the church archives. Spent hours in the vestry leafing through dusty records. Said she was researching the Edgewater Regiment for a book, though I never saw her write a single page. And did she get along with Colonel Maddox? Mrs. Tewkesbury hesitated. He was cordial at first, but I do recall him saying, "Oh dear, I shouldn't gossip." "Do go on," Miss Marple said, gently encouraging. "Well, he told my husband last week that she'd asked too many questions. Something about his grandfather's service, or medals, or uniforms. He wasn't pleased, said, 'The past's buried for a reason.' Very unlike him. Not unlike men who've spent a lifetime honouring appearances," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Tewkesbury blinked. "You think he—" "Oh, I think nothing yet," Miss Marple said, patting her friend's hand. "But one mustn't mistake silence for peace. In villages like ours, the two are often unrelated. At that same hour, Inspector Cray was pacing the vestry of St. Mildred's with an expression of mild annoyance. The pewter buttons were now in evidence bags, and the coroner's early findings suggested Violet Green's death had occurred at roughly 3:30 p.m., almost exactly at the height of the garden party. "No bruising to indicate a struggle," he muttered, "but the neck's broken all the same. Not something she'd do to herself." He glanced down at the notes his constable had taken. Known to stir trouble. Arrogant, private, intelligent. No family, no friends. "Not no friends," said Father Tewkesbury gently, entering the room. "She spoke to me once or twice about her work. She believed secrets were like mould. You only find them when the light's just right." Cray gave him a flat look. "Philosophy doesn't help me, Reverend." "She believed someone in the village was hiding something," the vicar continued. "Military related. She asked if I remembered any missing plaques or improperly recorded dedications. And did you? I said no, but it got me thinking." He crossed to a narrow cabinet near the back wall, opened it, and pulled out a faded parish logbook. "There's a line here, see? A memorial service for a Private Thomas Maddox, 1916, Colonel Maddox's uncle. But there's no record of his name on the monument in the churchyard, and I know it used to be there." Cray blinked. "You're saying someone erased it?" "I'm saying Violet noticed it missing, and that it may not have been accidental." That evening, Miss Marple returned to the church under the pretence of lighting a candle. The air was cool, and the scent of polish and age hung in the air like a quiet warning. She passed the altar, dipped her fingers in the holy water, and knelt. Then, instead of returning to her seat, turned toward the side aisle where the war memorial stood. 31 names, etched in brass. She had studied them many times over the years, but now she looked for absence. No Thomas Maddox. She stepped closer and noticed something else. At the edge of the plaque, just above the bottom scroll, a single screw was newer than the others. Bright silver, not dulled with time. She smiled, faintly. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. The days following Violet Green's death passed with a peculiar stillness over Edgewater, as though the village were holding its breath. The garden party had been packed away, the bunting taken down, the cake stands returned, but the unease lingered, like a draught slipping beneath a closed door. Miss Marple spent her time as usual, attending to errands, exchanging recipes, and tending her roses. To the casual observer, she was doing little more than knitting her way through her second shawl of the season. But in truth, she was watching, as she always did. And what she saw was that the villagers were behaving, in a word, badly, not in ways that might concern the police, but in the subtle telling ways that revealed guilt, fear, or most often, the urgent desire to appear blameless. At the post office, young Peter Larch, who delivered Violet's mail, was quieter than usual. "Expect she didn't receive many letters," Miss Marple said gently. Peter looked up from behind the counter. "Not many, no, but she sent quite a few. Big envelopes. Archival stuff, she said. Went to London mostly." "And did she seem worried? Or excited?" He hesitated. "I don't know. Both, maybe. One time she asked me if I thought the people here were proud of their history. I said yes. She laughed. Not kindly." Miss Marple nodded, satisfied. Inspector Cray, meanwhile, had turned his attention to Colonel Maddox. The two men sat in the Colonel's drawing-room, surrounded by reminders of military service, framed medals, regimental banners and sepia photographs of stiff-jawed young men in uniform. "You served with distinction," Cray said, glancing around. Maddox nodded curtly. "Yes, and my family before me." "You found the body," Cray continued, "and a pewter button. Yes, I bent to pick up a napkin, and it was there by my foot. Odd thing. Didn't even know I'd lost it. Must have come off an old jacket." "You wear old uniforms often?" "Not exactly," Maddox said stiffly. "I have a regimental blazer I wear for Remembrance Sunday. Might have come from that." Cray raised a brow. "2 buttons, Colonel. One found by you, the other beneath the overturned table. Unusual, isn't it?" "I've no explanation," Maddox replied. "But I assure you, I had no quarrel with Miss Green. She was persistent, yes, asked questions, dug where she shouldn't, but I had nothing to hide." Cray flipped a page in his notebook. "What about your uncle, Private Thomas Maddox? Served in the Edgewater Volunteer Guard?" Maddox's eyes narrowed. "I don't discuss family disgrace." "So he was disgraced." The Colonel exhaled slowly. "Deserted at the Somme. Court-martialed in absentia. Never seen again. My grandfather struck his name from the family Bible. It was a shame we bore silently. Until Miss Green started asking why his name was missing from the memorial. She had no right to resurrect it," Maddox snapped. "My family suffered enough without being dragged through it again." "Did you speak with her the day of the garden party?" "No. I avoided her." Cray closed his notebook, unconvinced. That evening, Miss Marple stopped by the churchyard on her way home. She paused at the war memorial again. Her hand brushed the lower corner of the plaque, where a faint outline remained, proof that a name had once been there. She had seen how carefully the village preserved its public image, and she knew, from long experience, that few things upset respectable people more than the possibility of disgrace, especially disgrace made visible. As she stood in the fading light, she heard footsteps behind her. It was Sarah Calthorpe, the church organist. "Oh, Miss Marple!" Sarah flushed. "I didn't mean to intrude. I sometimes walk this way in the evenings. It's peaceful." "It is," Miss Marple agreed. Though less so of late, Sarah nodded. Poor Miss Green. You knew her? I played at the service she attended. She was always polite, but intense. She once told me the church had secrets in its stonework. I didn't know what to say. Miss Marple smiled. It's not an unreasonable thought. Secrets are often kept in public places. People believe if they're visible, no one will look too closely. Sarah hesitated. I think she believed she could fix things by exposing them. And you? I think some things aren't hers or anyone's to fix. There was a sadness in her voice. Miss Marple tilted her head. Did she ask you anything about the plaque? Sarah looked away. She asked if I thought anyone would notice if a name disappeared from it. I said, yes, eventually. Miss Marple said nothing, but made a small mental note. Sarah knew, possibly more than she admitted. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple added to her growing page of observations Pewter, letters sent to London, research. Maddox admits uncle was a deserter, anger genuine, but did not see Violet at party. 2 buttons, 1 deliberate, 1 accidental. Sarah knew about name erasure, regret in tone, Violet's motive, truth, others' motive, silence. She turned the page. Chapter 4. First Suspects. By the end of the week, Inspector Cray believed he had found his man. Colonel Maddox, he announced at the station to his constable, is too calm for someone at the centre of a sudden death. The button, the missing name on the memorial, the timing, they all point to him. It's the most straightforward explanation. Constable Redfern frowned. But, sir, Miss Marple said— I know what Miss Marple said, Cray cut in, but this is a matter for trained professionals, not a tea-sipping amateur. Still, Redfern hesitated. He, like many others in Edgewater, had learned that Miss Marple's opinions, however gently delivered, rarely proved mistaken. Meanwhile, Miss Marple was paying a quiet visit to Violet Green's cottage. Margaret Tilling, the housekeeper who had come in twice a week, met her at the gate with red eyes and a dish-rag still clutched in one hand. She never gave me any trouble, Margaret said, leading her inside. Bit sharp, yes, but always polite, paid me fair. Said little, though. Spent most of her time reading or writing letters. Miss Marple glanced around. The cottage was small but tidy. Bookshelves lined one wall, all of them filled with local history volumes, many bearing the faded stamp of the Edgewater Library. A small writing desk stood by the window, stacked with unopened mail and a leather-bound journal. She used to, when she worked, Margaret continued, dusting a picture frame. Old songs, military some of them. Said her grandfather had served. Miss Marple nodded. Did she ever have visitors? Not once. She approached the desk and lifted the top page of the journal. Margaret made no protest. Violet, after all, was no longer here to mind. The entries were sparse and businesslike, but one stood out. Colonel Maddox denied any knowledge of Plenty Maddox, but town records indicate a property transfer in 1938, from Thomas to Edmund. Quiet transaction, no mention of dishonour. Why the pretence, shame, or concealment? Miss Marple blinked. Edmund? She read it again. Not Colonel Maddox. Reverend Edmund Maddox. Back in the church office, Father Tewkesbury stared in shock at it. The revelation Miss Marple laid before him. Reverend Maddox, he repeated. But he passed years ago. I performed the burial rites myself. I believe he was the son of Private Thomas Maddox," Miss Marple said quietly, "and the father of Colonel Maddox." The vicar leaned back, stunned. So Violet wasn't looking into military disgrace. She was tracing inheritance. Discovered that the land Colonel Maddox lives on was once legally owned by a man declared dishonourable. Miss Marple continued, but whose name had been erased from history, and possibly from legal documents, meaning the Colonel's claim might not be valid at all. Quite. The vicar was silent for a long time. So her death might not be about shame. It might be about property. "Shame makes people retreat," Miss Marple said, "but greed makes them act." Later that day, Inspector Cray stopped by Colonel Maddox's home once more, this time with more purpose in his step. "We've reopened the inquiry into your uncle's disappearance," he said, "and we'd like to ask about the inheritance of this estate." Maddox's expression changed. "That's private business." "Not if someone was killed to protect it." The Colonel stood. "Are you accusing me of murder, Inspector?" Cray met his gaze. "You're a suspect, that's all." Maddox folded his arms. "I didn't kill Miss Green. But I did know what she found. She confronted me, twice, said the land was tainted. I told her to leave it alone, that my family had suffered enough. Did you threaten her?" "No," he said. Then, more quietly, "I begged her." Cray didn't look satisfied. That evening, Miss Marple paid a social call to Mrs. Winifred Clay, an elderly widow with a penchant for birdwatching and an uncanny memory for village affairs. She lived next to the Maddoxes when Edmund was still alive, Miss Marple said over a modest sherry. "Oh yes," said Mrs. Clay. "Quiet man, kept to himself, but proud, you know. Proud of his father, despite the shame. Never denied the connection. Said he'd restore the family name." "And did he?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Clay tilted her head. "He tried, took the church post, raised his son well. But there was always something unfinished." Miss Marple leaned closer. "Do you remember anything about the estate? The land they live on?" "Well, I know it was left to Edmund in a bit of a hurry. There was some legal fuss, but no one made it public." Miss Marple nodded. "And if someone were to prove that transfer invalid?" Mrs. Clay's eyes gleamed. "It would scandalize the Maddox name all over again." Back in her parlour, Miss Marple took up her notebook again. Colonel Maddox. Inheritance possibly. Invalid. Violet discovered it. Reverend Maddox. The connection Violet was tracing. Estate records altered. Violet confronted Colonel. Motive not only shame, but legal risk, possibly eviction. She paused, then added a new line. Chapter 5. A hidden clue. It was on Thursday morning, while arranging the dahlia stems in a jug by her window, that Miss Marple received a most curious delivery. The post arrived as usual. 2 circulars, a postcard from her nephew Raymond in Florence, and 1 brown envelope with no return address. Inside was a small object wrapped in tissue paper, a pewter button, identical to the ones found near Violet Green's body. Miss Marple turned it over in her fingers. It was cool, smooth, and unblemished. Unlike the first 2, one scuffed, the other slightly tarnished from weather. This one had a faint smell of polish, and no wear at all. She examined it closely beneath the lamp. The crest was crisp and sharp. It had not come from the garden. It had been prepared. She murmured aloud. Someone's trying to be clever. That same afternoon, Inspector Cray was standing in the vicarage study, staring with frustration at the war memorial records. "They don't make this easy," he grumbled, flipping through faded pages and brittle notations. Father Tewkesbury, who had come at the inspector's request, peered over his shoulder. "They didn't keep things electronically in 1916, Inspector. The vestry record book is in Reverend Maddox's handwriting. That's the best we have." "Which makes it all the more suspicious," Cray replied, tapping the blank space on the current memorial plaque rubbing. "No mention of Private Thomas Maddox, but we know he served and vanished, and now Miss Green ends up dead after looking into it." The vicar hesitated. "You don't think the Colonel would—" "I think a family name means more to some than law or justice," Cray said darkly, "especially when property is involved, but—" He trailed off. "But?" prompted the vicar. Cray frowned. "It's too clean. The buttons, the story, it all fits, which makes me suspicious." Miss Marple, meanwhile, had made her way to the village library. She rarely required permission to browse, but on this occasion she requested the key to the restricted archives. Mrs. Wilmot, the librarian, handed it over without hesitation. "Miss Green was in there often," she said almost fondly. "Always asking about land deeds and military rolls. Said she was writing a book on Edgewater's forgotten history." "Did she say what kind of history?" Mrs. Wilmot shrugged. "Military scandal," she said. "But more than that, she mentioned something about deliberate omissions. She had a talent for unsettling people, that one." Miss Marple entered the small archive room and began with the obvious: land grants, military rosters, and village maps. The name Maddox appeared multiple times, most often tied to property along the western edge of the village. Then, tucked behind the 1939 folder, she found a thin envelope labelled Veterans Relief, 1922. Inside, a list of disbursements, from the government to former servicemen. At the bottom, in faded ink, Bichun T. Maddox declined. Record incomplete, service unresolved. She also noted one adjacent name. Calthorpe, A. Noted for field commendation. Letter enclosed. Miss Marple frowned. Calthorpe. The name was familiar. She had heard it recently. Sarah Calthorpe, the choir's organist, who had been oddly hesitant when asked about Violet. Was it possible? She flipped through to the back of the folder and found a small folded letter. It was yellowed, but legible. A citation of bravery under fire. Recommendation for commendation. The recipient, Alfred Calthorpe. The final paragraph made her breath catch. Private Maddox took responsibility for misfired orders to protect Calthorpe, whose actions saved 3 wounded men from shelling. The command confusion was never formally resolved. Miss Marple set the letter down gently. Private Maddox hadn't deserted. He'd been sacrificed, his name tarnished to save another. And now someone had tried to silence the only person uncovering. It showed later that evening, Miss Marple made her way to the modest home of Sarah Calthorpe. The young woman answered the door with ink-stained fingers and music sheets tucked under one arm. "Oh, Miss Marple, is something wrong?" "No," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Merely a social call." Sarah hesitated, then stood aside. The room was sparsely furnished. A piano by the wall, a reading chair, and a small fireplace. Miss Marple sat with the ease of an old friend, then produced the button from her handbag and placed it on the table. "Does this look familiar?" Sarah stared at it. Her expression didn't change, but her voice thinned. "It's one of those army buttons, like the ones on Colonel Maddox's coat. It came to me in the post," Miss Marple said. "Clean, polished, not found in a garden, you understand. Sent, planted." "I don't. What are you implying?" "That someone wanted to steer suspicion, and that someone understands precisely how people see Colonel Maddox." Sarah said nothing. Her eyes dropped to the button. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The air in Edgewater grew heavy with the scent of turning leaves and suspicion. The days were still warm, but the crispness of autumn whispered through the hedgerows, rustling secrets long buried in the soil. It was in this atmosphere of uneasy quiet that Miss Marple found herself in the offices of Edmund Maddox, the village solicitor and Colonel Maddox's younger brother. His small office sat above the chemist's, tucked away behind a door that bore an aging brass plaque, Maddox and Son, Legal Affairs and Conveyancing. The name had lingered, though the son was long gone. Edmund himself was a thin man, stooped, at the shoulders with a perpetually downturned mouth and fingers stained with ink. He greeted Miss Marple with polite confusion. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise. How may I assist you?" She smiled gently and took a seat opposite his desk, resting her handbag on her lap. "I hope I'm not intruding, Mr. Maddox. I've simply come with a few small questions about Violet Green." Edmund stiffened ever so slightly. "A tragic business. I didn't know her well." "No, I don't suppose many people did," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "But it seems she had been consulting legal records, land ownerships primarily." Edmund nodded once. "That's correct. She came by last month to ask about inheritance filings from the 1930s. I referred her to the archives." "You didn't find her inquiries unusual?" Edmund folded his hands. "Unusual, yes, but not illegal. People investigate family trees for all sorts of reasons nowadays." Miss Marple studied him. "Mr. Maddox, did you know that the estate your brother now lives on once belonged to your grandfather, and then, legally, to your father?" Edmund flinched. "It was a family transfer." "There's no probate record," she said softly, "which means Miss Green may have uncovered a falsified deed, perhaps one you were involved in." His eyes darted to the side. "I was a junior clerk then. I simply did what I was told." "By your father?" Edmund didn't answer. "She also uncovered a military citation," Miss Marple continued, "showing that your grandfather was accused of desertion, but that he may have taken the blame to protect another soldier, Alfred Calthorpe." Edmund leaned forward, voice lowered. "None of this is relevant to her death." "Isn't it?" Miss Marple asked gently. She threatened to expose the truth. You had both motive and opportunity, a knowledge of where to strike. He looked at her, a long, cool gaze. "She was going to ruin this village," he said at last. "Tear open old wounds, overturn property claims, destroy my brother's name and my father's before him. And for what? A girl with no roots here, no understanding of what it means to protect a legacy." Miss Marple folded her hands. "So you admit—" "I admit nothing," Edmund said sharply. "And if you have no official business here, Miss Marple, I must return to my work." She rose with a nod. "I understand. Thank you for your time, Mr. Maddox. You've been quite illuminating." Outside, the wind stirred the hedgerows, and Miss Marple paused on the steps. There had been no confession, of course, but there never was, not in the early stages. What mattered were the cracks in the facade, and Edmund's had just begun to show. That evening, the village held its monthly parish council meeting in the community hall. Attendance was thin, but tensions ran high. The murder had cast a long shadow. Colonel Maddox sat stiffly in the back, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Sarah Calthorpe arrived late, her hair unbrushed, her eyes tired. Peter Larch lingered awkwardly by the tea-table, clearly out of place. And then there was Margaret Tilling, Violet's housekeeper, who, for the first time, stood to speak. "Think," she said, voice trembling, "that Miss Green deserves a public word." There was a murmur of agreement. "She came here alone," Margaret continued. "But she was kind. She listened to people others ignored. She cared about truth, maybe too much. But she didn't deserve to be left in a rosebush and spoken of only in whispers." Silence followed. Colonel Maddox rose. "She dishonoured my family's name," he said, but with less force than before. "But she wasn't cruel, and perhaps some truths are overdue." He sat again, exhausted. Miss Marple remained, silent, listening. After the meeting, she approached Peter Larch outside under the gas-lamp glow. "Peter," she said kindly, "you delivered Violet's post, didn't you?" He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Did you ever see who picked up her outgoing mail?" His brow furrowed. What do you mean?" "Letters don't always travel alone," she said. "Sometimes someone intercepts them, especially if they're being sent locally." Peter hesitated. "There was one afternoon. I left the outgoing satchel on her gate like usual. When I came back 5 minutes later, it was open, nothing missing, far as I could tell. But someone had tampered with it." He nodded. "Thank you, Peter. That's very helpful." Chapter 7. Another twist. With the time Sunday arrived, Edgewater seemed to hold its breath again. The murder investigation, which had dominated every doorstep and shop counter for over a week, now simmered quietly, just beneath the surface. Miss Marple, after church, strolled slowly along the village green. She nodded politely to passing parishioners, but lingered deliberately near the home of Margaret Tilling. Violet Green's old cottage, now quiet and shuttered, looked as if it had never housed anyone of note. And yet, within those walls, a storm of truths had been uncovered, and Miss Marple suspected others were still waiting to be found. She had made arrangements with Margaret the night before, and now approached the cottage again, this time with a purpose. Margaret greeted her nervously. "You're sure this is all right? I wouldn't want to be in trouble with the police." "Perfectly all right," Miss Marple assured her. "The police have their methods. I have mine." Inside, the air was still tinged with lavender polish and old ink. The writing desk was untouched since Miss Marple's last visit, but today she had asked Margaret to open the locked side cupboard, one the constables had apparently missed in their earlier search. It opened with a creak. Inside were several thick file folders, neatly labelled in Violet's hand. One read, Edgewater Estate, Title Dispute. Another, Private Correspondence, Maddox Family. But the one that caught Miss Marple's eye was simply marked, The Pewter Button. She opened it and found, at last, context. There were several pages of typed notes, as well as a map of the village overlaid with inked annotations. The most curious among them was a letter, To whom it may concern. If this reaches you, I have likely been silenced. The evidence here concerns the falsification of land records related to the Maddox family estate and the deliberate removal of a name from the war memorial. The root of this falsification lies not with Colonel Maddox, but elsewhere. Miss Marple leaned closer. It lies with Edmund Maddox, solicitor and executor of several disputed claims. There is reason to believe he altered legal documentation to obscure a dishonourable discharge from the family record and preserve the estate under fraudulent precedent. The letter was unsigned, but the typing, the paper, the tone were unmistakably Violet's. Miss Marple read it twice. Then she turned to the final page in the file and froze. There, tucked in with the notes, was a photograph. It showed two young men, clearly from another era, seated on a bench, their uniforms neat, one bearing a sergeant's stripe. The back was labelled in Violet's pen, Thomas Maddox and Alfred Calthorpe, 1916. Confirmed friendship prior to some orders. But that wasn't what held Miss Marple's gaze. In the background, almost blurred by sunlight, stood a woman. She wore a long coat and held a child by the hand. The woman was unmistakably a younger Winifred Clay, Margaret Tilling's aunt, and the child, if one looked closely enough, was Edmund Maddox. Miss Marple left the cottage shortly after, her mind racing. The falsification of records had deeper roots than even she had expected. Edmund hadn't simply preserved a legacy. He had grown up knowing the truth, that the family name rested on a falsehood, and that a man's disgrace had become a foundation stone for his future. And now that truth was unravelling. She returned to her cottage and pulled out her notebook. Violet traced the altered title of the estate, the erasure of Thomas Maddox's name from the war memorial, the military citation protecting Alfred Calthorpe, and now an early photograph proving contact between Edmund, the Maddox family, and the Calthorpe's motive. Legal exposure, family dishonour, ruin of professional reputation, but new possibility. Edmund may not have killed Violet. He may have tried to stop her. Who would silence her permanently? She paused, pencil tapping against her palm. Someone with access to her files? Someone who knew what was coming? Someone who knew enough to frame Edmund? A shadow crossed her face. Colonel Maddox. That afternoon, Miss Marple attended a meeting of the Village Preservation Society, held rather awkwardly in the same hall where the garden party preparations had been finalised weeks earlier. The topic of discussion was supposedly the repainting of the schoolhouse doors, but everyone's mind was elsewhere. Colonel Maddox was in attendance, seated near the back. His once proud posture seemed deflated. He no longer met the eyes of his neighbours. After the meeting, Miss Marple approached him. "You seem weary, Colonel." He managed a faint smile. "Tired of suspicion, Miss Marple, that's all." And yet, she said, the suspicion may not be entirely misplaced. He glanced at her sharp now. Are you accusing me? I'm asking you, she replied, if you knew your brother had forged the deed transferring the estate into your name. He stiffened. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The golden light of late afternoon spilled across the village green as Miss Marple strolled toward the small cottage at the edge of Wren's Lane. Autumn was settling into Edgewater in earnest. The breeze, just sharp enough to tug at the corners of scarves and the edges of secrets. Her destination, however, was not the vicarage or Colonel Maddox's home, but the humble lodgings of Peter Larch. Peter, Edgewater's 20-year-old postboy, lived with his aunt above the greengrocer's. He had been in the background of this mystery since the start. Quiet, nervous, always watching, Miss Marple knocked gently on the door. It was Peter who answered. "Oh, Miss Marple." "Hello," said, blinking in surprise. "I wonder if I might borrow a few minutes of your time, Peter," she said kindly. "I promise it's not about your punctuality." He opened the door wider, and she stepped inside. The small sitting-room smelled faintly of bread and boot polish. Peter gestured for her to sit. He looked uncertain, fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve. "I know you were there, Peter," Miss Marple said without preamble, "on the day Violet Green died, not just in the garden, but at the rose bushes. You saw what happened, didn't you?" His mouth opened, then closed. You don't have to protect anyone," she said gently. "But I believe you were the only one who saw her last moment, and I think it's been weighing on you." Peter stared at his shoes for a long time. "She fell," he whispered. "She didn't scream. She just fell. And then someone bent over her. Who?" Peter swallowed. "It wasn't Colonel Maddox. I thought it might have been, but it wasn't." He looked up. It was Mr. Edmund. I saw him come out from behind the trellis. He was holding something, a folder, I think. He looked pale, not angry, just pale. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "You didn't say anything. I didn't want to get involved," he said miserably. "And when everyone started talking about the Colonel, I thought it was better to let it be." Miss Marple stood and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, Peter. You've helped more than you know." That evening Miss Marple wrote 2 brief letters. One was addressed to Inspector Cray, requesting his presence the following afternoon. The other she hand-delivered, slipping it through the letterbox of Edmund Maddox's office. A simple message, written on her best stationery. "There will be a gathering at the vicarage at 2 o'clock tomorrow. I believe it is time we put the matter to rest. J.M." The next day, under a pale sky and the watchful gaze of the war memorial, the suspects gathered at the vicarage. Colonel Maddox arrived first, sombre and drawn. Sarah Calthorpe came next, pale and tense. Margaret Tilling stood off to one side, clasping a handkerchief. Peter Larch kept his eyes on the ground. And last of all came Edmund Maddox, briefcase in hand, his brow furrowed. Inspector Cray stood by the fireplace, arms crossed. Miss Marple, seated by the window with her knitting resting in her lap, looked at each of them in turn. "I thank you all for coming," she said calmly. "I realize this is most unusual, but I have found that when truths are hidden, sometimes only a quiet gathering will allow them to surface." She looked at Edmund. "Mr. Maddox, You intercepted Miss Green's files, didn't you? Sir opened his mouth, then closed it. I did, he admitted. I feared what she'd uncovered would destroy everything my family had built. But you didn't kill her. He looked up, startled. No, he said. No, I didn't. I confronted her. I pleaded with her. She refused. I left her by the rose bushes. I thought she might reconsider. That was all. Miss Marple turned to Sarah. You knew what your father had done. That Private Maddox took the blame for him. Sarah's lips trembled. Yes, I didn't want it known. Not because I was ashamed, but because I thought people would see my father differently. He was a hero. He let someone else take the fall. You told Violet to stop. I did. But I swear, I never touched her. Miss Marple nodded, then turned to Peter. You saw something more, didn't you, Peter? Peter looked up, his voice barely audible. I saw Violet argue with Mr. Edmund. Then I saw her step back. Her foot caught the trellis. She lost her balance. She fell. There was a collective gasp. She wasn't pushed? Cray asked. No, said Peter. But the look on Mr. Edmund's face. I think he knew she was dead. And then he took the folder from her bag. Cray turned to Edmund, expression sharp. You removed evidence from a crime scene. Edmund nodded, shamefaced. Yes, I was afraid. Miss Marple spoke once more. Afraid of what the truth might do to a name. But in doing so, you deepened the mystery. You allowed suspicion to fall on your brother. You watched as the village chose a scapegoat. And all the while, the truth remained a simple, sad accident, complicated only by fear. There was silence, then Colonel Maddox spoke. Chapter 9. The Reveal. The following Sunday dawned crisp and golden, the air filled with the scent of turning leaves and wood smoke. Edgewater was beginning, tentatively, to return to itself. The vicar's sermon that morning was more subdued than usual, dwelling on themes of truth and redemption. Parishioners sat in quiet reflection, their eyes occasionally flicking toward the front pew, where Miss Marple sat with folded hands and an expression of serene attentiveness. Word had already spread, of course. Not the full story, but enough to satisfy the village's curiosity. Violet Green's death had been ruled a tragic accident, caused by a fall, not malice, but the deeper truth, the one that could not be published in the parish circular, was shared in more hushed tones over tea and sponge cake. That evening, in her cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple sat with her friend Mrs. Banbury over a modest supper. I still don't understand, Mrs. Banbury said, spooning jam onto a scone. If no one killed her, why did it all feel so sinister? Miss Marple poured another cup of tea. Because, my dear, death, intentional or not, has a way of shaking loose the masks people wear. And Violet Green, with her questions and her quiet determination, threatened to unravel more than one carefully managed reputation. Mrs. Banbury leaned forward. But that poor solicitor, what will become of him? Mr. Edmund Maddox will be formally reprimanded, Miss Marple said. Possibly disbarred, but not imprisoned. He admitted to interfering with evidence, yes, but he did not cause Miss Green's death. And now that the truth is known, I suspect he will retreat from public life with as much dignity as he can muster. And Colonel Maddox? A humbled man, said Miss Marple gently. Perhaps for the better. He has seen what silence and inherited pride can do. He will keep his land for now, but perhaps with a more open heart. Mrs. Banbury sipped her tea. Still, I would never have guessed. All that fuss over buttons. Miss Marple smiled. Ah, the buttons. In truth, they had been the key all along. The first button had been found beside Violet's body, overlooked at first as incidental. But Miss Marple had seen at once what it symbolized. Not a struggle, but a statement. A military badge of honor, or dishonor. The second had been planted, deliberately, almost too obviously, an attempt to divert suspicion onto Colonel Maddox. The third, delivered to her door in an envelope, had been the most telling of all. It hadn't come from the Colonel, nor from Violet. It had been sent by someone who understood that symbols could be louder than confessions, and more misleading. Someone who had feared exposure, even more than blame. And yet, in the end, it had only highlighted their guilt. The village memorial had been restored within the week. Miss Marple stood quietly in the churchyard one afternoon as the final screw was driven into the updated plaque. She had written a small note to the vicar recommending the addition of one name, Private Thomas Maddox, who, in protecting another soldier from scandal, had borne shame in silence for decades. His legacy deserves honesty, she had said, as does our village. Nearby, Sarah Calthorpe stood watching, hands clasped tightly together. When the worker stepped away and the plaque shone anew in the afternoon sun, she approached Miss Marple. "I've never thanked you," she said softly. Miss Marple smiled. "There's no need, my dear. But I hope you found some peace." "I think I have," said Sarah. "I was so afraid that my father's story would be lost, or worse, misunderstood. But now, perhaps, people will remember him differently." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the name. They will. And in remembering him, they'll remember Thomas Maddox too, a man who gave up honor to preserve it. They stood in silence a moment longer, until the chimes of the church bell reminded them both of the hour. Later that evening, as Miss Marple returned home, she paused by her writing desk and took out her notebook. She turned to the final page and wrote, in her neat hand, "The truth once buried blooms quietly when given light. Violet Green sought justice, not vengeance." She stirred the dust from names long forgotten, and in doing so exposed the rot that comes from secrets held too long. But the greatest deceit was not her death, nor the legal lies, but the belief that silence would protect honor. In the end, only the truth can do that. She closed the notebook. Then, as she always did after solving a case, she folded her knitting into its basket, made herself a modest pot of cocoa, and settled by the fire with her thoughts. Outside, the church bell tolled once, and Edgewater, once again, fell into its quiet rhythm, older, wiser, and perhaps a little more honest than before.